What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining me today. Hey, I'm really excited. This is one of the, or it will be one of the most strategy intensive videos, certainly that we've done. I've brought on my GTO expert coach and the resident GTO expert for PLO Quick Pro, Corey Mikesell, to help me really learn about solvers, teach you guys about solvers, and get the most out of PLO solvers. You know, PLO solvers right now are sort of the hot topic of discussion for all PLO players, or I should say serious PLO players. And it's kind of been a under the radar thing for, I would say, about the past year. You know, no limit solvers have been around for several years and completely evolutionized how regs see no limit hold'em. And the same thing is happening now with PLO. It's sort of like a mad scramble to get all of the solver information that's out there. And I remember actually when solvers first came out, there was sort of like this whispering going on in the high-stakes PLO community, people Skyping each other, messaging each other, saying, oh, have you heard about the new solver that came out for have you heard about Monker solver? Have you heard about this new solver? And now, you know, it's becoming a little bit more widespread. People are more openly talking about solvers, but as you'll hear Corey and I talk about here in a moment, one thing we've realized is that a lot of people are either completely misusing solvers or just aren't getting enough out of solvers or as much out of solvers as they could. And specifically in 3-bet pots, we've really noticed this trend. And of course, as we'll get to in a moment, we've also got a great new course going over the GTO approach to playing 3-bet pots. But let's save that for later. For now, I want to introduce you to Corey Mikesell. Corey, again, is kind of my go-to guy for GTO play, and he's going to teach us a lot about the biggest mistakes that players are making in 3-bet pots in today's games. And we're actually going to do a little bit of screen sharing here in a moment and go over a couple of hand histories that illustrate these mistakes well. So, Corey, thanks for joining us here today. Why don't you say hello, and then also maybe just expand a little bit on what I touched on in terms of your experience with solvers in general, and then also what you think about how PLO solvers have changed the game so far, even though they've only been available for a couple months.
Yeah. So I started playing poker about, I'd say, 4 years ago in No Limit, and it started at 10 NL, and within a year or so, maybe a year and a half, I climbed up to high stakes and then started using the solvers in No Limit. And so I kind of made all of the typical rookie mistakes that everyone was making at the time. Those mistakes were just trying to play too much like the solver as opposed to thinking about how the outputs tell you something about the mistakes your opponents are making. Other mistakes were like inputting poor pre-flop ranges or not recognizing in a tight range spot how much like one combo is enough to swing solutions back and forth. That's more of a thing in No Limit. But as I saw that the game was evolving more rapidly and, you know, computers were improving and just kind of anticipated that bots would come out in No Limit eventually. And so I wanted to transition over to PLO. What I figured out is that I was able to use PIO Solver, which is the No Limit solver program, and kind of tweak it and manipulate it to get some kind of bare bones PLO solutions. And the thing I started working on was 3-bet pots and understanding kind of what optimal play looked like there, because 3-bet pots and No Limit and PLO are just drastically different. So that's where I wanted to put a lot of my emphasis. And yeah, so I think in general there are a lot of benefits to having a solver, but there are a lot of traps. And it's kind of reminds me of doing math problems in high school or college where you can like flip to the back of the book, see if you got the solution right. And it's a great way to like check your work, but it's also a great way to deceive yourself and like, oh, I know more than I actually know. So that's one of the big traps, is kind of looking up a single hand and saying, oh, I played it right because the solver says I should bet 80% of the time, and I did. That doesn't necessarily say anything about how your opponent's playing. And so really what we've concluded is that the solver is a very useful tool, but it's a tool that you have to learn how to use properly. You have to understand what optimal play looks like, and then be able to anticipate the mistakes your opponents are going to make, and then be able to adjust those optimal solutions to exploit those mistakes. And I think that's the real strong point of the book, and kind of just our approach is we're not into memorization. We're into critical thinking and most importantly, exploitation of our opponents using optimal play as a baseline.
Yeah, a lot of really good points there. I think most importantly, what you mentioned was players taking the solver solution as the golden rule for every situation. You know, let's say you're in an argument on a forum or with a friend about some hand that you played. And then you can't, it's not like you can just say, well, I put it in Monker and it says this, so that's that. Like, Monker says to do this, this is the hard and fast rule for the situation all the time. What it does do is, like you said, it gives you a good baseline for the right line to take under certain circumstances. Exactly. But it's your job as a poker player to weight those circumstances and then still adjust accordingly. Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And recognizing like your opponent's pre-flop range, recognizing what bet sizes they would have used. These are all kind of like limitations and mistakes people can make using the solvers.
Right. So now let's talk about two specific areas. The first question I'll ask you is, we were just talking about this a moment ago, but what do you view as the biggest mistakes that you see players of all levels, I guess, but particularly even advanced players make in 3-bet pots? Like, what are the big trends that you've seen, or what have you found that has been proven or unproven with your work using the solver?
Yeah, so there are a few things that jump to mind in that department. I think one is not betting big enough. A lot of times I see on videos people are like, oh, I bet half pot, I bet 2/3 pot, because that's just what I do. And a lot of times the bet size doesn't matter all that much. It's more about the range that's behind the bet size, and the bet sizes themselves, you only have maybe 1% of the pot to be gained or lost by choosing the wrong bet size. But there are some times, some spots that we discuss in the book, where like it's clearly correct that you need to just bet pot. And if you were allowed to, you would probably bet larger than pot, but it's PLO and we can't. So there's a lot of kind of like, I pick this because it's what I'm comfortable with, as opposed to, no, I need to actually put work in and find out what is the correct bet sizing approach. I think another huge one is that people use a lot of like qualitative judgments about boards. This is a good board, this is a bad board. And so to begin with, there really aren't that many bad boards for a 3-better. The 3-better's range is just stronger. Obviously, there are boards that are worse for that range and boards that are better, but I think people are overly passive on boards that they kind of qualify as, this is a bad board for me. We talk about it on the 7-6 deuce spot in the book, that this is a board we actually play like incredibly aggressively on. It seems like a low board, 3 low cards, and it's certainly not the best board for us, but that the good or badness of the board doesn't necessarily inform our strategy. That's more true at like deep SPRs, where you just can't stick in a bunch of money without the nuts. But at low SPRs, it's more about that hierarchy of like pretty good hands battling with other pretty good hands to realize all their equity and capture as much of the pot as they can. And so playing too passively in a spot like that is just death to your win rate.
Yeah, a lot of really good points there. I think that I've certainly been guilty of that, saying, "Oh, well, like this board just connects way too well. This board hits his range better than it hits my range." But then, when you and I were going through the videos that supplement the book, I'm actually going through what our equity is against a range, and I'm like, wow, like actually, it's pretty clear that I've been approaching these boards incorrectly, which we'll get into in a second. Now, I know a lot of people probably joined or are viewing this for some of the more specific strategy stuff, and we've got that, which we'll hop into now. Now, what we've done today is, and let me pull over here on my screen and share my screen. So what we've done today is this is similar to what we go through in the book. We pick a board texture, and then we run through exactly what Monker says to do on this board, right? So now today we've picked, as you'll see here in a moment, King 9-7 two-tone, and we'll run through the example, and I'll let Corey sort of steer the ship here in a moment. But I do want to expand real quickly on why you focused on doing 3-bet pots for this book, or why you decided to focus on 3-bet pots in the first place when you finally got your hands on some solver technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of on my transition from playing high stakes no limit to moving over to PLO, I just felt like 3-bet pots were a spot that I didn't understand very well. So partially it was for selfish reasons. I wanted to improve this area of my game. But it's also a spot that it's very mathematical, and player tendencies matter. Of course, they always matter, but there are a lot of hands that you're just getting it in with, and it's kind of like predestined when you hit that flop that the money is going in. And so playing those decisions correctly is very important, because it's kind of like there's a narrower window that you have to crawl through to make the correct plays. So I felt like that was pretty valuable. I also felt like all of this knowledge would apply to low SPR single raise pots, so against short stackers or as a short stacker ourselves or in a tournament. So I was able to apply all this knowledge to playing a short stack as well. And then we also realized that low SPRs happen even in deep stack play. The SPR is 10, somebody bets half to 2/3 on the flop, and then suddenly we get a turn with SPR 4. A lot of these concepts, almost all of them, really apply to that spot as well. The ranges are different. So I wanted to create kind of a mental model or a framework that I could apply to a lot of different areas of the game. And this seemed like really low-hanging fruit for me to go after that would like dramatically improve my play quickly.
Right, and I wanted to add something to that, and it's actually something that you taught me that I hadn't thought about, which was the more that you can 3-bet, the more it also helps protect other areas of your range. Like, so for example, if you play 3-bet pots out of position more, then you deny your opponent the ability to open as many buttons, for example, is a good way to think about it. And also, Corey had a good point the other day, as he said that if 3-bet pots are higher variance, there's more big blinds at risk, you're going to be playing big pots more frequently. So realistically, if you mess up one 3-bet pot in a session, it can actually have a really big impact on your win rate over the long term. So knowing how to play these will not only make you more money, but it'll also make you tilt less, because let's say that you lose a big pot, but you at least are confident that your decision was correct. Well, now that makes you tilt a lot less because you can be less concerned about the results. Is that accurate, Corey?
Oh yeah, I mean, the more certainty that I've had playing, just the less I tilt, because I'm like, oh, I just like you're not tilting when you're like getting it in with aces, the guy gets it in with kings, and then you lose. You're like, I got the money in good. Like, what's tilting about that?
Right. So here today, as I mentioned, we're going over King 9-7 two-tone, and I want to hop into the action. So we're going to see here in a moment, it's a really common situation. 100 big blinds, where we 3-bet from the button with a 10% range, facing a 50% opening range from the button. Of course, in a situation where the button is 4-betting, looks like strong aces and kings essentially, or all aces and then probably some of the stronger kings. Is that right?
Yeah, and let me just comment on why I chose to use a poker juice range for button.
Uh-huh.
I've looked at the optimal ranges from Munker, and I don't feel like they model the way humans are playing very well. So, like interesting things. Here's a good strategy tidbit. People are not slow playing aces pre-flop almost ever. Like I rarely see that, and so that's something that the solver does quite a bit. The solver 4-bets less, it opens tighter, and folds a lot of times it folds more than people are folding. So I wanted to pick ranges that modeled actual human play. And so one thing I noticed is people are opening 55% of the time on the button, which the solver's opening maybe a little bit tighter. So that was just the reason I chose that range as opposed to just choosing the optimal range in the solver. Again, it's like we want to think about how our opponents are actually playing.
Sure. So we can see immediately a big blind, the big blind with a pretty big equity edge, which is at least pre-flop, right? With 57% to basically 43%. Now, explain quickly for people who aren't familiar with Monker why for the big blind it says Ace Queen 10-6 double suited, and for the button it says Jack Jack 10-3 rainbow.
Yeah, so this is kind of actually a cool feature of Munker that when you bring, this is a screenshot of that graph, which is the equity distribution of the ranges for button versus big blind on this board texture. And there's a little scroller that you can take back and forth across those ranges and highlight different hands in the range. So this hand, the Ace Queen 10 with a flush draw, means that probably the scroller was somewhere in the middle of the graph. But if you drag your scroller to the far left, you're going to see hands like King King, 9-9 with a flush draw, King 9 with an open ender, things like that. So it's a cool feature that the program has.
Got it. Okay. So I don't think that there's too much to go over here in terms of the equity distribution. It's pretty obvious that the big blind's going to have a big equity edge versus a wide button opening range.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about kind of the more unique graphs that you've made for the book that can give us some insight into what the best approach is for choosing the range of hands with which to c-bet. And as you mentioned previously, what's more important, people overemphasize their sizing, but what they underemphasize is which hands to actually c-bet with. So talk a little bit about what the best approach would be here, and I'm actually going to bring up the flop on Poker Juice so we can get a little bit of a visual.
Yeah.
So talk for a moment about what this graph is telling us and how we can interpret it.
Yeah, so this kind of just gives us a flow chart of all of our betting and checking decisions. So one of the really useful things that I derive from these graphs is kind of like, where's the bottom of my value range? Like, what are the weakest hands that I'm going to be potting and going with here? And so we see that there's a big drop off kind of in the middle of the graph right at King 7. And so that's kind of like a line indicating like, okay, hands that are better than King 7, like bear made hands. So any set, King 9 is going to be strong enough to go with. And then we can see kind of hands like top pair, top kicker with a flush draw, and a lot of these different combo hands are kind of, they actually have more equity than something like a bear King 7. So this helps you not only recognize like where is the bottom of my value range, but also order the hands in your mind and familiarize yourself with the equities, realizing that like, oh, this is like, it's better to have top pair with a flush draw than it is to have like bear top 2. So I find that very useful. And then I would look at this and say, okay, this is optimal play. So how is my opponent likely deviating when they respond? Because if their response to my optimal strategy is not an optimal one, then I can exploit them somehow. So for instance, if I think that my opponent is shoving in too light, then I probably want to extend my value range and say, okay, well maybe now King 7 is strong enough to pot call and get value because this guy is getting it in too light. But conversely, I would like to remove some of my weaker bluffs because I'm just pot folding more.
Right. Nope, that makes a lot of sense. And I think in general, like from what I've seen from the solver, it basically advocates a pretty polarized betting strategy on almost every board for the most part. In general, would you say that that's right?
It's much more polarized for in position because for in position, the EV of checking back is so high that it doesn't really make sense to bet many of those middling strength hands because like bet folding is tragic and even betting and narrowing their range is unfortunate. So in position is extremely polar. There's definitely always polarity in betting ranges, but out of position tends to merge somewhat more because hands that are kind of like middling strength and like middling to the weak end of our range, if we were in position, we would check them back and realize equity. But here, when we check and face a bet, we usually have to fold. So it's kind of unfortunate to have to check fold those hands. So they often make more money by betting. Whereas when we're in position, we need bluffs, so we bluff with our air. When we're out of position, we don't really want to bluff with our air because we don't get that many folds because the player in position calls wider, and we're just betting with like no equity. So we get called, we end up out of position with no equity against a narrower range. We're just like punting money off.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's move on to like the next section here, and I think it's really valuable that you kind of break down every section of your range and give a little bit of a commentary, which I think is cool. Now we're talking about the button defense. Basically, we're talking about the other side of the problem now, right? We're talking about how the button can defend facing a pot-sized button c-bet, right? So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the basically which hands we should call with and which hands we should fold with, or I'm sorry, which hands we should call and which hands we should shove, and we're also looking at what percentage of the time to do it with. And as what else is cool is that you have in parentheses here what percentage of our range each one of these combinations makes up. So glancing at the graph here, what's the major trends that we're seeing? I mean, obviously we're jamming a lot of hands that have good equity but not very much visibility. So like for example, a lot of like ace king with a flush draw, it has a lot of good raw equity, but it can have a lot of turns that really damage its equity.
Yeah.
And of course, like the type of hands that we're calling with are hands that are super nutted that have a lot of safe turns that gets value from our opponent's bluffs, right? What else are we looking at here?
Yeah, so let me first give a brief explanation how to use this graph. The blue lines indicate calling, red lines or orange lines indicate shoving, and then as you can see, they're descending over to the right side of the graph. Kind of that empty space indicates folding, essentially. So far left is our strongest hands. I think what you pointed out is very important, that like, okay, with the very top of our range, it makes sense to do a lot of slow playing because we want to keep their weakest hands in. We don't want them to fold when they have like, they're potting into us with a weak gutter or something like that. When we have top set and like top set plus a flush draw, where we just end up blocking all of their outs. Yeah, so we see King 7 again is kind of that threshold hand, where this is a hand that I see people jamming, like they're jamming too light. They say, oh, I've got top and bottom and the board is draw heavy, so I'll just stick it in. But what they don't realize is, okay, when they're up against king nine or a set, they're crushed. When they run into our aces with the nut flush draw, they're not doing that well. When they run into some of our combo hands are even going to be ahead of them, like slightly. So hands like that, it's very important to not just like give up on your position and jam everything in. It's important to think about like, how do I use what's left in the stacks to make better choices than my opponent? I can look for safe turns, like offsuit low cards here to get it in. I can maybe find some folds on some of these connecting cards. So I think that's a key, is just like recognizing that the hand doesn't end when someone c-bets into you. Like, just because we're sticking a lot of money in doesn't mean that there aren't still good decisions to be made.
For sure. I totally agree. As you mentioned, one of the biggest mistakes that you see is that people either fold or jam a lot in three-bet pots,
Right.
and they don't really have enough calls in their range. So I can definitely, and on these boards in particular, I'm against nits. I am fine just jamming because they're usually just going to call. But
Mhm.
against certainly in more aggressive dynamics, I try to mix in more calls, especially with the stronger pieces of my range. As you mentioned, like hands like top, like King King Queen Jack or something, or King King Jack 10 or
Right.
King King, yeah, those types of hands.
Right, and that's the correct deviation, is that like if somebody's a nit and they're potting into you, they probably don't have any folding range. So like then it makes no sense to slow play with your nutted hands, because you just can get all the money in now. You never have to risk anything. But against
Yeah.
someone like me, who is going to actually have some folds, you're going to be missing those opportunities to catch more bluffs on the turn, for instance.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, let's move on to the next section. So now we're talking about the situation where we check and the button stabs. So and it's against like a half pot stab, which I like on a wide variety of boards in the button
Mhm.
spot. I mean, I don't like just potting it most of the time.
Mhm.
Um, I do like this type of half pot stab when the big blind checks on a variety of different boards. But here we're looking at what the buttons should realistically be stabbing with. Um, so we really don't want to stab with, like, I guess, a naked or like bottom two type of hands. We should be stabbing, of course, with hands that we want to build a pot with and stack off with, and hands that have a big equity advantage. What else are we looking at here?
There's a fair bit of blocker bluffing with like bare top pair hands, which I found kind of surprising and interesting. Something that I've incorporated into my game is that like when you have a really weak king, very rarely you'll get to show it down and be good. So it actually can kind of serve as a blocker bluff, just kind of blocking their top set, which should actually check a fair bit. The other main thing is to not value bet too thinly. So these hands like the 9-7 and the King 7 that actually are not that strong, and when you get check shoved on, it's really unfortunate. You end up having pretty poor equity. Uh, and it's very important to like structure your range so that you're using multi-component hands that are never really in bad shape. Um, Hands that like cover multiple runouts as your strong value range. And then we see kind of like a dip in that middle region where there are a lot of hands that have between 60 and 40% equity, but we don't really want to bluff with them because like it's great to check back when you have 40% equity and realize that equity.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Now I know what the next graph is going to be. It's the big blind's defense against a half pot stab, right?
Right.
So scroll up a little bit. So we see a lot of calling, decent amount of check shoving.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, as you mentioned, the ideal hands to check shove with are hands that have low visibility, but also are kind of multi-component, where they have some equity even against the nutted part of our opponent's range, right?
Right.
So
So
go ahead.
yeah, it's interesting. It's like humans call it low visibility because like that's how we think in terms, but it definitely exists in the solver as well. The solver is just trying to maximize expected value, and so what it sees kind of quote unquote with these like low visibility hands is like, oh, this hand is not going to make the nuts that often on a number of runouts, so it's going to be very hard to value bet and put in the top of like a polarized range on a turn or the river. And so it's hard for me to get to maximize my EV by continuing this hand with calling. So it's definitely true, like visibility matters. It's just interesting to see how our brains have to think about things differently than the solvers, but we're both actually kind of coming to similar conclusions. So that's one of the things humans seem to have gotten right.
Right. Interesting. Okay. And then here we're talking about, now we're getting into later street stuff. So I want to, let's see, I want to make sure that so that people can see. Okay. There we go. All right. You get the hint. Well, okay. On this board, or with this graph, now we're getting into later streets, and we are, let me get the turn out there. Now this is a very static turn, right?
Yeah.
Turn is the deuce of diamonds. So now let's look at equity against the range for each other. So now the button's equity has gone up a little bit comparatively. Now it's a 47 to 53 with the out of position player with the advantage, I think it's just because both players can have a lot of flushes in their range, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of flushes. Some of the weaker flush draws, like bare nut flush for out of position, will not want to pot. So a lot of those will kind of get removed from the range by betting. And so button will be jamming their like two pair with flush draw, but very often when they have like a bare nut flush draw, they'll be calling, right? So we remove some of those from our range by betting, and they add more of those to their range by only calling. So that's why it kind of evens out the distribution a little bit more. But what we do notice is that at the top, or at the kind of, I'd say somewhere between like 40 percentile to 90th percentile, we still have a pretty significant advantage. At the very tippy top, we both have a lot of nut flush. So at that very top of the range, we're not necessarily favored. But now that the SPR is 1, the top of the range essentially doesn't matter. It's just like a cooler. If you have a flush and the guy has the nut flush, it's just like you have SPR 1. What can you do?
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, now we're looking at optimal quarter double barrel for the big blind, which I think you don't see that much of nowadays. So it's kind of fun to look at this as an option for, and I want to make it a little bit more zoomed so we can get a good look at it. So it's interesting to think about this line. How applicable do you think that barreling for quarter pot is to games, or like real games, I should say, rather than just putting it through the solver?
Yeah, I think this is a reasonable and applicable one, because if you're playing reasonable opponents, they're going to recognize that they probably shouldn't be jamming their bare nut flush draw over your pot size bet. And so they'll end up getting here with a decent number of flushes, and we've kind of talked about how we structure our range. And so really where the sizing comes in is that we're leveraging kind of the top end of our range, and we're trying to pick a size that geometrically grows the pot so we can maximize the number of bluffs that we get. So I think this is actually something that I incorporate into my game, and I think is pretty useful. And if you think about it from an exploitative perspective, you can imagine that your opponents will be pretty unfamiliar with the strategy, and so they're more likely to make mistakes. It's just up to you to anticipate in which direction they'll make those mistakes.
Sorry, one thing that I think is interesting is it shows like not a super high barreling frequency with the aces with the ace of diamonds. I would actually think that that would be a good candidate to barrel quarter pot with, just because you have some leverage, you block the nut flush. But as you mentioned, maybe I don't know. I guess I thought that that would actually be a good candidate to double barrel for that sizing.
So I see ace of diamonds, ace betting about 80% of the time.
Oh, really? I guess I was looking right here for 40%. So it is actually still a high frequency. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just misread it.
But you can imagine that there are some hands now, like bear ace ace, that obviously, like excluding the blocker, is kind of like middling strength, and so we don't want to always keep building and inflating the pot. And
Yep.
It's like hands like that, we kind of hope it just checks down.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So now we're talking about button inflection point hands versus optimal turn double barrel. So why don't you spend some time talking about inflection point hands, because this is a concept that I haven't seen really talked about in other books, but I think that you explain pretty well.
Yeah, so if we think about like when I'm playing and I'm thinking about like how I want to structure my range when I'm betting, I'm often thinking about what hands am I making indifferent? Like, okay, what is an indifference target in my opponent's range? Because that's what game theory is about, is to neutralize your opponent's EV. So when we're betting the range above, we can look in the solver and say, okay, what are hands that are kind of like on that fold or call threshold? Because hands that are going to be like fold sometimes or call sometimes, that means that the expected value of that decision is the same. And so these are hands that we can look at and say, okay, this is a hand that we're trying to make indifferent with our bet when we structure our range this way. And then we can think about, okay, is my opponent likely to call this hand? Like, so if I see somebody just snap call and on the turn and they get to the end of the hand with something like the king 8 6 5, then I'm going to know that they're probably calling this hand too often. It might be that they're folding other hands too often, but it's more likely than not that they're calling too wide on this turn. And so from there, I can begin to exploit them by saying, okay, you're over defending this spot. So I probably want to subtract some of my bluffs, add some thinner value. And I can use that by looking at these kind of individual spots and using them. They're kind of like the gears of exploitation. They're like turning one way and somebody's like overcalling, you turn them another way, somebody's overfolding, and those are the places that we can look to take advantage of our opponents, because like when they have a flush, they just call, and that's what they should do 100% of the time. It doesn't tell us anything.
That makes a lot of sense. And we've got that, yeah, like you said, we've got 1/4 range double barrel exploits for the big blind, and then button inflection point hands as well, which I think is pretty interesting. So now we're talking about the big blind's optimal triple barrel range. And this is, I think, a really great example because the turn's very static and then the river's a brick. So it's just like another very polarized static street.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at what we really need to be triple barreling with here.
Mm-hmm.
And of course we see everything that's nutted. Our nutted range is, for the most part, all flushes, right? It says remaining flushes anyway that's in our range for the most part. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it.
and checking most of our set combos, I guess, unless it's a set of nines, which I think is somewhat interesting. I guess it's advocating turning nines into a bluff-ish. I don't
Um,
know.
this is really interesting. This is like one of the big discoveries that I've had with the solver, and it kind of goes back to something I saw in a Run It Once video where Daniel DeVoris was talking about like choosing to shove some of these middling hands on the river, and he was like having trouble articulating why you would want to do that. Like ultimately, the reason that you make a decision in poker is because it's the highest EV decision. Uh, the reason that a lot of these middling hands end up shoving is they almost perform like a blocking bet type function. It's not pure value. Like when you get called, it's probably not that good. But what you're thinking about is, okay, when I check and my opponent creates a polarized range, my EV of a lot of these hands that choose to bet, like 9-9, is actually going to be very low. Maybe I'll be totally indifferent, which means that it'll be a 0 EV fold or call. And so I just need to look to see if shoving could produce more EV. And the reason that it might is because, especially when the SPR is very low and we jam, they have to defend at a certain frequency. They want to meet the minimum defense frequency, or on the river that doesn't always apply, so they want to at least call a certain amount. Otherwise, we would just get to always bluff. And so when we jam a hand like nines, yeah, we run into better very often, but we force them to make some calls with worse hands, and in the long run, that produces more EV than checking and facing a bet that forces us to be indifferent or creates indifference where we have like 0 EV. That's essentially what's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of players kind of look at it more like, is my hand good or is my hand not good, and not thinking about their entire range. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's really changed the way that I approach rivers, and it ends with me jamming a lot lighter, and it's amazing how well it works, because like a lot of times you'll be potting the turn, like check raise flop pot turn, and you'll have like SPR of a third of a pot on the river. You just jam it in, and like your opponents have to find light calls, and they do. You're like, oh, that was a really thin value bet, but feels
Right.
great.
Right. That's awesome. Okay, so now we're talking about big blind triple barrel versus a button who folds all one pairs on the turn. So what we're really talking about is our opponent just having mostly, he can literally only have like 2 pairs and flushes.
Yeah, so it's just kind of visualizing like, okay, what's a common mistake our opponents are likely to make on the turn? Well, we bet 1/4 pot on a 3 flush turn. I think a lot of people are not going to defend adequately. And so if we imagine somebody overfolding on the turn, that's good. We've kind of like won there. But we also need to realize that their range is now changed. And when we get to the river, we can't just play the same strategy pretending that they still have all these 1 pair hands. We need to think about how we would want to alter our strategy given the fact that their range is now stronger. For instance, we see 9-9 no longer is that blocking shove, because now there are far fewer of those weaker hands that can hero call, so the expected value of jamming that hand goes way down. And so this is actually a much more polar strategy.
Yeah. And you can see on the right, like, the jack and the 10 of diamonds just give up, essentially, because you don't block enough stuff.
Right, exactly.
Yep. But you're still jamming, of course, like the ace of diamonds.
Mhm.
A lot of queen of diamonds combos, it looks like. Or no, sometimes it looks like it's off. But actually fewer
Yeah.
queen of diamonds, and then all of our flushes. Still says to jam a set of kings, just because I guess it's still a value bet, it thinks.
Yeah, and I mean, again, also we want to, it still kind of performs that blocking function where if we check and let our opponents create a polarized range, the expected value of king may just go way down because they may make that hand indifferent.
Right. Okay. And now we have more inflection point hands, right?
Yep.
Do you want to briefly talk about what the inflection point hands are for in the triple barrel situation?
Yeah. So this is the optimal triple barrel where big blind is shoving, and so we see kind of why a hand like 9-9 ends up shoving in the optimal solution, because look, like king 9 with a diamond calls very often, and 9-7 with a diamond calls very often. So these are hands that we're getting value from, but if we check with a hand like 9-9, they're never, like king 9 with a diamond isn't jamming into us, right? So we take the initiative, which is something that I talk about in the book. It's a concept that's kind of been like removed from poker, but it actually exists. We force them to react to us and have to make a call or fold decision rather than getting to check back and being able to show down and minimize the damage, essentially.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well that wraps up this section, or I should say the strategy session of our video. Now I just want to talk briefly about our new course called 3-Bet Pots, Game Theory and Practice. You've seen a good portion of this book so far in this video, and you can tell it's extremely advanced. I've been really impressed by the book. I've learned a lot about playing 3-Bet Pots just from going through it. We're going to post a link here in the description, or we're going to post a link in the comments for if you want more information about it. But Corey, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add about the book, or who exactly it's for, but now's probably a good time for that.
Yeah, so I think the book is targeted to, I'd say, like 1, 2, and above players online, and I could think of 5, 10 plus players live. I would say are kind of our target audience. I'd say if you're much below that, it's probably too challenging, and I'm not sure that you would get enough out of it. But wait and improve your game and come back to it maybe in a year or so. But yeah, I mean, I think the book is very in-depth, but you can go over it multiple times. And so it's something that I come back and reference. And there's a big emphasis on not memorizing things. It's about gaining understanding, and very importantly, gaining understanding that can be applied to other spots, right? So I'm talking about, like, okay, how am I applying some of the river sims that I've done and applying it to a spot where it's a single raise pot and I check raise, bet turn, and then jam river. I'm applying that generalized knowledge and then tweaking it for the ranges and the specific board texture. I think that's the real strength of this book, is that you take something as complex as like every flop in PLO or every single 3-bet pot, and we distill it down to ideas that you can really wrap your mind around, and then you can apply those to single raise pots. You can apply them to games that aren't even PLO.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's the strength of the book, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And also included with the course, at least the GTO package, is more than 10 hours of video of Corey and I doing exactly this, going through the most important chapters of the book and really reviewing them in Poker Juice, talking you through them, giving you a walkthrough of exactly what the important takeaways are. So I think it's valuable, as Corey mentioned. I mean, for anybody, I think playing higher than 1-2, it's pretty easy to justify investing in the course just because, I mean, it's like one session, right? And, just one point of the book that you pick up could, over a career of playing poker, make you, tens of thousands of dollars easily, for sure. All right, well, that'll wrap up this video for today. Thanks everybody for joining, and of course you can always reach out to us at PLO Quick Pro. You can reach out to me, John at PLOQuickPro.com. And if you have any questions about the book, feel free to ask me or write in support at PLOQuickPro.com. Thanks for joining, guys.
Thanks.